Diseño and mimesis. If there is a relevance of Mannerism for contemporary art, perhaps even a return of Mannerism in contemporary design, we must stop looking back to Mannerism in terms of the 19th century dialectics between the degradation of the operative into automated modes of production and the subsequent longing for pre-industrial handicrafts. That's really the whole crux of the arts and crafts movement and nostalgia romanticism. At first, this enterprise may well seem paradoxical. Mannerism marks the achievement of the equality between the mechanical arts and the liberal arts in defiance of the trade guilds. It is the moment when the hommes de l'art, engineers, sculptors, potters, emancipate themselves from mere craftsmanship by providing their practice with a reflection on principles and method. Yet this emancipation comes at the price of a new division. In one and the same move, Vasari sanctioned the distinction between art and craft, or between the major and minor arts, in order to save the aristocracy of the three, arti del disegno, art of design, painting, sculpture, and architecture, and constituted art as a field of intellectual knowledge, thus also providing the self-legitimation of artist as a coherent and recognizable order of historical progression. In the Mannerist arts of design, everything seems to depend on the strict division of labor between genius and work, conception and execution. Whereas Alberti, this is an earlier late 15th century art historian and art theorist, architectural theorist, whereas Alberti warned us against placing too much trust in their genius, advising them to confine themselves to the great model that is divinely created nature, Michelangelo relied on his ingegno. This is literally genius, the power of his artistic mind to improve nature instead of merely imitating it. Nature for him was no more than an occasional cause pulling forth the ideas virtually contained in the intellect. Famously, Michelangelo seems to argue that while the marble already encloses the idea of the work of art, it would be the task of the intellect to actively recognize the form of this content and of the obeying hand merely to free it from the surrounding mass. The best artist has no concept, concetto, which some single marble does not potentially enclose within its mass. Only the hand which obeys the intellect, intelletto, can accomplish it. Of course, the ancient and medieval traditions also knew this distinction between two successive stages in artistic creation, conception and execution. But even in the Renaissance, rules had been developed only for the second stage. With Mannerism, by contrast, the new intellectual dignity of the liberal arts demanded reflection on the conception or design, meaning drawing, but also trained judgment and mental synthesis, and on the coordination of the two stages. Following the Neoplatonic tradition, the eye judges and the hand executes, but each under its own conditions. As Federico Zuccaro put it in a well-known passage from Idea of the Sculptors, Painters and Architects, 1607, or the thought of the artist has to be not only clear, but also free, and his spirit has to be released from and not limited by a mechanical dependence on such rules of execution provided by the mathematical sciences. According to classical humanist interpretations inspired by Burckhardt and ratified by Panofsky, what unites the eye of the artistic genius and the hand of the skilled craftsperson is the conjunction of idea and mimesis. For Vasari, each of the three arts of design still relied unequivocally on the mimesis of the visible perfection of nature. Subsequent theorists such as Vincenzo Danti, Gian Paolo Lomazzo, and Zuccaro, by contrast, sought the freedom of art in the imitation of the concetto or idea, which becomes the sufficient reason for the work of art. For example, Dante, in his Trattato delle Perfette Proporzioni, writes that an artist should not simply copy, ritrarre, visible nature, but should imitate it, imitare, in its purposes, that is to say, he should imitate the perfected intentional form of nature. Whereas men such as Alberti and Leonardo were anxious to curb the latent artificiality of the idea, insisting on natural depiction, the conflict between realistic imitation and artificial improvement, objective matter and subjective manner, now made its full appearance. With the doctrine of disegno interno, or internal design, again coming to us from Federico Zuccaro, the drawing after an internal design guiding the hand that replaces the disegno esterno, external design, of external models that dominated Renaissance formalism, the idea emerged as an aesthetically autonomous standard of perfection, eventually becoming a pre-existent concept independent of nature and execution. Art no longer relies on knowledge of reality, but competes with it through its self-conscious sapere dell'artifice. It begins to develop its own strictly artistic knowledge that is to be taught in special academies. For example, the Florentine Academy of the Arti del Disegno, which transformed art from studio craft into philosophical study, accompanied by critical literature on aesthetic problems. For the first time, concepts of art, criticism, and art history are articulated as such and form a kind of closed circuit, a discourse, in which artists inspire critics and historians who write for well-trained practitioners. Mannerist painting, art historians tell us, is gemalte theory, painted theory. In a paradoxical way, then, the Mannerist apology for artistic freedom tends to go together with an unequaled emphasis on the academic training and rational systematization of creativity, whereas in the Kantian aesthetic, the faculty to know nature would be strictly distinguished from the faculty to judge art, rendering the aesthetic idea transcendent to all rational argument. Mannerism sought to unite idea and conceptual rule in terms of an imitation taken to the limit. At the limit of an imitation, we discover the aporetic tension between the subjective abhorrence of rules and the fascination with objective know-how, between irrational but creative genius and rational but pedantic craftsmanship. This tension may always have been at the core of Western art, but is now made productive in a self-reflexive fashion. Panofsky therefore argues that in Mannerism, the idea ceases to be merely a model, as it was in Renaissance classicism, and becomes properly plastic. From Vasari onward, we witness not only the birth of art theory and art history, but first of all, the beginning of reflection on the conditions of possibility of artistic creativity in general. Henceforth, the history of art is able to define itself as the automobility of a strictly artistic idea of perfection and its imitation by degrees, the imitazione fantastica. Do you remember how we were talking about circle thinking and triangle thinking?
Not quite. Could you remind me?
It was about the Renaissance, the artists, they had ratios and proportions that they used. Say, the head of a person in a painting must be exactly 1/7 person's body, for example, and then the Mannerists rebel against that or break against that.
So actually, in that example, what's interesting is you might have this formalized theory about what is perfect art. As you said, with the triangle guidelines, the proportionality of...
Yeah, there are rules of art.
And what's funny is through this principle or through this idea of the golden ratio, which seems to be like a perfect guideline that is everywhere in nature, and therefore you're imitating the perfectibility of nature in implementing this into your art, you get pieces of work that seem to be beautiful. But then as that idea becomes more and more established, you edge into this kind of pedanticism where purely through mimesis and purely through this kind of rote execution, people get sick of it a little bit. Not so much that it's like plundered for all it's worth, but that there is a creative insignia or whatever that is art, but surely there is art beyond this. And so in rebelling against this perfected concept, you get art which is also beautiful. So it seems to me that there's this kind of tension is a driving motor of, I wouldn't say progress, but it just seems to be that this sort of tension between these conceptualized modes is something that drives art to be made in the first place.
People always need art.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the tension between Mannerism and the previous and later art movements, like the classical Renaissance art and the Baroque art, and how they viewed Mannerism. And Baroque art wanted to pull back to a traditional form of art, and so they saw Mannerism as like a spasming that had to be flattened out. But it's funny how there's this TikTok of movements.
Well, you know how I describe that three-phase movement? If you think of Mannerism as the primitive, you could say that in Mannerism, the elongated fingers and things trying to show movement through exaggeration. In the next phase, the Baroque painters rationalized that into just showing the movement by using light. And Mannerist paintings usually have several different vanishing points, while a Baroque painting wouldn't necessarily do that. But then it's the rationalization of those new discoveries. The Mannerists pushed the art to its boundaries. Then the next phase, the Baroque rationalized all those new discoveries into rules. Then they became vulgar and they were everywhere. And then people got sick of them. And then there's a new breakthrough or a return to a pure, exaggerated or primitive style. And that's how it goes on.
Sorry, in my mind, all I can think of is that meme where it's like, good argument. However, I've already painted you as the soy jack and myself as the Chad. I just need to inject a third guy that's like, be that as it may, I've already plotted the three of us amongst a threefold movement where I am the vulgar one, you know?
Well, it's hard to say whether Mannerism it goes against the end of the Renaissance because it breaks with the rules, the proportions. But whether then you could say that there are three, but it just feels like how all styles get broken down into three. Like the French call the first type of Gothic primitif, which means Gothic primitive, and then the High Gothic, what we call decorated in English, and then finally the third phase in French is flamboyant, which means flaming, and it's super elaborate, has all these swirls and lattices, and they're actually functional as well in distributing the weight in the glass windows. And it looks a bit like flames in a way. That's why it's called flamboyant. If you imagine in the Roman times, the really ornate architecture was only for the temples and the civic buildings, and you could say the palace of the king. So all the other architecture subjugated itself against that. And then in the next phase, those building rules from the finest buildings were then rationalized and utilized in domestic buildings. And then finally, they became vulgar, and all the wealthy people, at least the bourgeoisie, put ornate decorations in their manor houses and villas. But you have that same thing happens with the Gothic. Then all the wealthy merchants begin to use, there's a guy called Jacques Lecoeur in France. They begin to build their mansions in the really elaborate Gothic style.
I think sometimes when plotting out this movement, there's a somewhat obvious line to trace between the primitive, the high, and the vulgar. For example, through architecture, you can really point towards the concrete. It's grounded in the buildings themselves, so there's something to actually shape that line to. Whereas when it comes to art movements, for example, how the Baroque artists probably considered their movement against Mannerism, all of a sudden it's a lot less grounded and it's purely speculative because the Baroque artists thought of themselves as the rationalization of Mannerism, but you could just as easily.
I don't know that they thought of themselves as the. That's an interesting one. Whether they thought of themselves as the they wouldn't have thought of themselves as the rationalization of the Mannerists.
How do you think they would have considered themselves?
They saw themselves as modern. And in fact, Baroque is the first style that is described as modern. So they considered the Mannerists primitive. That would fit with the three phase view. But I was also going to say to you, this also plays out in literature. We love Raymond Carver, kitchen sink realism. It's like a really cut down, basic speech. And then in the next phase, the language gets a bit more flowery. And then finally, it becomes overwritten and over elaborate. And there's a return to, and Murakami is a good example of that. It's a return to the kitchen sink realism.
Yeah, very much so. And I guess that's one of the positive things about mimesis is that when an artist replicates, for example, if I was to try to write a piece of kitchen sink realism, I can't just go and rewrite a Carver novel word for word. So with mimesis, there's still a form of an artist injecting what they'll inject into it and writing something new. But at the same time, if you were to only write in that one genre, there's perhaps other genres you could have written that would have been even more lovely. So I can see where there's that tension between strict replication and artists breaking through to try and do something else.
This is something that I've been thinking about recently, the paradox of originality, that if everything influences everything else and that all sort of reflects all else, then there is really nothing that is wholly original, or that originality derives out of copying everything else. And that quote there, Dante writes that an artist should not simply copy visible nature but should imitate it in its purposes. I thought it was interesting that there is a discernment between copy and imitation, and that to imitate relates to a perfected intentional form of nature. And I was reading that idea of perfected intentional form of nature as originality, that there's some sort of ideal form that you're trying to get at, which you could consider as originality.
Well, it is original. There was a fascinating thing about AI saying you could feed an AI all of the art of today, but it couldn't make the breakthrough and give you the new art. If you fed an AI all the art before Michelangelo, it couldn't give you the breakthrough of Michelangelo. It wouldn't produce what he produced.
Yeah, it could only copy what came before, but it really can't get at those periods of rupture that humanity can. That's something that Ulysses Carrier talks about in Technically Man Dwells Upon This Earth.
There is like a very uncanny aspect to an AI generated piece because there's very much a tension between creativity and mimesis when it comes to an AI generated image. Because I think we really struggle to conceptualize what exactly is happening between a machine that we theorize can only not even imitate but copy, in the sense that when it comes to like binary code, for example, and when you copy and paste, what you're engaging in is a little bit of hyperstition in the sense that it doesn't imitate a file or even necessarily replicate it. What happens is anytime any data or piece of data is produced, all data is defined by its irreducibility, or rather, all data is multiplicative at its inception. So when you create a copy of a file, it is a lossless, perfect, exact version rather than a copy as such. It is the same thing exactly. And by nature, this is just how data has to operate. And so when we see the outputs of large neural networks that have this like mass amount of input and they spit out these images, the thing that we really struggle to conceptualize is that even though an image might appear to be new, and by all accounts, there has been no image like this ever before, if anything, it's like a very deeply intricate network of PNG pixels. Like when you zoom in on any AI image, oftentimes you'll find images that are one file format like a PNG, but when you look really closely, they've got JPEG artifacts all over them because the model has usually been trained to pick up on these imperceptible JPEG artifacts and replicate them because it's all it knows how to do. So you get these compression artifacts in pieces that shouldn't have them. And so really what we have is like an extremely sophisticated imitation, or rather, I don't even want to say imitation so much because that ascribes like a creative quality, which may or may not be the case when it comes to these models. It's really hard to conceptualize with the words that we have with exactly what we're seeing, because to us and our subjective experience, we might see an image that has never been seen before ever in the world, and there is no image quite like it. But again, in terms of data theory, since all images are multiplicative at their inception, same thing goes for like AI output. So we sort of lack the vocabulary to really consider what's happening when we see output like that.
It's like AI is trying to replicate the dynamism of nature, but all that it's really doing is putting as many heterogeneic copies together in the form of one picture. And I guess we could look at that natural dynamism as the, quote, perfected intentional form of nature that Dante says we should attempt to imitate rather than just copy what we see.
Interesting. What were you going to say, Jay?
The original Dutch word for painting is counterfeit, as the word we use now, counterfeit, like a fake copy of a piece of money.
I've talked about this many times before, but this just reminds me of the idea of imitation and art forgery. We've gone over it a few times, but art forgers are extremely skilled craftspeople because not only do they invent a new piece of art, they invent history itself. And usually they're creating original works that are highly imitative of the original because they can't be the same piece of work. They've got to be something new, but they're going to be close enough down to the brushstroke of an artist. And I always find that a very fascinating thing.
That's like the definition of figure, too. The figure does cut a semblance with reality, but it's not reality itself.
Stretches back to Pythagoras a little bit in terms of these representations of shapes which really don't exist. The triangle just does not exist.
Do
The perfect
triangles
square does
exist
not
in
exist. I stand a little bit with Alan Watts when he says Pythagoras probably didn't have a very creative intellect. He saw a mountain, and instead of seeing a mountain, he saw a triangle. But it's like a mountain is anything but. It is everything else before it is a triangle, you know?
even in the sense of the fact that they're 2D figures when we're thinking of those figures. But do y'all want to keep reading?
I don't mind. We're on now. There are at least two problems.
Now there are at least two problems, one historical and the other aesthetic, with this account of the Mannerist idea. The first, obvious one is that Michelangelo's reference to the intellect should not be understood in anachronistic subjectivist terms, but in a much more distributed fashion. On the one hand, artists cannot be abstracted from the spark of divinity, scintilla di Dio, or divine sign, segno di Dio, Zuccaro's quasi-anagram of disegno, that inspires them. The new status of the plastic arts relies on an argument from design. Disegno is nothing other than divine speculation, which produces an excellent art. You cannot execute anything in sculpture or painting without the guide of this speculation and design. On the other hand, just as originality was not a value in itself and replication was not an everyday practice in the artist's workshop if he or she had one, the notion of ingegno, like that of perfection and maniera, was first of all used as a complement that referred either to the divine contribution to the artist's hand and or the artist's social status. The second problem is that the alleged rationalism of leading Mannerist theorists, although a direct and necessary extension of their discipline, hardly gives an adequate description of what actually goes on in Mannerist art, or indeed in any creative practice. The question is even whether their focus on the imitation or representation of the idea is fundamentally misguided. It is true that Mannerist discourse aims for conceptual knowledge about art. It constitutes art as an intellectual object and thus provides a self-legitimation of art as a coherent and recognizable order of historical progression. Already in Cennino Cennini's Libro dell'Arte, drawing distinguishes itself from the grinding of pigments, the preparation of wood panels, or the making of pens and brushes in that it involves something more than mechanical practice, namely fantasy. In Vasari, this becomes the power of the mind to form purely mental pictures, which is the fundamental faculty of judgment that relates the arts to all rational activities. For this reason, historians tend to focus on the epistemological purport of disegno and, as a consequence, take it as a figurative form of rational thought, even a metaphysical system of representation within the horizon of imitation as the final aim of art no less than of other, more explicitly knowledge-oriented practices. Yet, as Kant already saw, this epistemological conjunction of idea and imitation hardly enables us to cross the gap between theory and practice. Art becomes philosophical, yet philosophy forgets art. Hence George Didi Huberman's warning. Imitation in the Renaissance is a credo, but it is not for all that a unifying principle. But neither is the quasi-theological notion of the genius, in whom nature gives the rule to art without the artist himself being intellectually aware of it. For the point is not that the speculative idea of art lies outside of knowledge, but rather that knowledge of rules is only one technology of creativity, albeit an increasingly important one. In reality, there is always a circuit between knowing and acting. Ideas have to be treated like potentials already engaged in one mode of expression or another and inseparable from the mode of expression, such that I cannot say that I have an idea in general. That reminds me of Deleuze's claim that ideas are consecrated potentials in the lecture, What is the Creative Act?
Yeah, it's a Deleuze quote. Two regimes of madness.
Ah, okay. Neither in artistic design nor elsewhere do we find the purely theoretical opposition between speculation and practice, conceptualization and execution, genius and work. Creativity is not achieved at a single stroke, but involves a whole series of translations and transpositions from sketch to pentimento to painting, or from bozetto to sculpting or building. This means that, as Dewey puts it, wherever continuity is possible, the burden of proof rests upon those who assert opposition and dualism. We could add that, inversely, whenever such theoretical oppositions nonetheless persist, or even arise out of practical problems as so many necessary illusions, the task of philosophy is to demonstrate real continuity. It is the construction of the problem that counts, not only the guarantees required by the Platonic spirit of the age. This challenge pertains especially to Mannerism, where the blockage in the classical circuit of implicit theory and practice heralds a speculative regime of art. After all, only that which appears to lack essence or reason becomes the object of speculation. The problem of creativity only becomes abstract and gains in aesthetic expressivity if its practical embedding in some wider milieu is disrupted. We do not speculate at will, as if speculation were some non-binding intellectual pastime. Rather, speculation answers to an isolated and passionate cry that makes it both impossible and necessary to continue, a rage of dispositions that leads to the contingency of form in relation to the intelligible character of the work. In fact, the clearest sign of some crisis of belief in the established schemata of the world is this treacherous tension between reason and passion. They despaired of speculative thought and at the same time clung to it. They had no high hopes of reason, but remained passionate reasoners. Situated between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, what is lacking in Mannerism is a belief in the world. Instead of the age of criticism, the Mannerist crisis was the age of speculation proper. The key here is that, as Bergson argues, speculation or metaphysical intuition is entirely active. As we have seen, Mannerism feeds on a procedural excess that frees the idea, in the form of a difference in mimesis, from the objective restrictions and standards of identity. What is at stake, Vasari tells us, is manner rather than natural imitation. Puis di maniera che di imitation naturale. This more of manner implies the modalization of what is imitated. Imitation is not based on knowledge, but on an operation that shifts perfection from the things imitated to the process of imitation itself. Thus, if art comes to need a theoretical legitimation, perhaps even subspecie divinitatis, as is the case in the nosology of Lomazzo, which is based on Neoplatonism and Hermeticism, and Zucchero, which is more Aristotelian, we should not mislead ourselves by saying that pre-Kantian aesthetics was somehow rationalist, whereas almost no 20th century philosopher would consider having an idea in art as an intellectual affair, let alone a problem of imitation. Instead of an epistemological interpretation, we should rather reintegrate metaphysical speculation with its application. As Zucchero stresses, the concept of internal design makes no sense when disconnected from practical work and sense experience. There is no intellectus speculativus without intellectus practicus, least of all in art. Thus, while it is true that with Mannerism art also begins to think indirectly, that is, through concepts, these concepts did not arise out of epistemology or philosophy, but out of art. As a consequence, whereas art is rooted in a speculative ability to visualize things that are not there, and therefore must have a clear idea of what they are doing, whereas cognitive knowledge follows post facto, it does not follow that this idea must be detailed or distinct or complete. The artistic idea is not just an intellectual intuition, but also an aesthetic intuition, even as it becomes the object of conceptual knowledge. It is closer to a confused passion or affective transition than to a distinct seeing. As a power, affect is the point where perception turns into action and vice versa. As a consequence, the idea is not distributed into whole parts relationships, clear light as synthesis analyzable indistinct but homogeneous parts, but among heterogeneous and indivisible intensities, that is, in mereological multiplicities. As Leibniz observed, artists' ideas are dynamic. They are usually clear but confused and thus easily perturbed by the distinct but obscure intuitions, the petite perceptions that populate the ground of their practice. Painters and other artists correctly know what is done properly and what is done poorly, though they are often unable to explain their judgments and reply to questioning by saying that the things that displease them lack an unknown something. Artists are visionaries or seers of ideas, provided that thought and action, eye and hand, aesthesis and genesis are only the extremes of a continuum of experience and expression. Whether in art or philosophy, reason is a seeking, groping experimentation with its material ground. Ideas are pragmatic, just as their eventual speculative conceptualization always has a practical orientation. Despite some art historians' predilections for written sources over images, we should not limit ourselves to theoretical subjectivity independent of the objective execution of the work of art. What matters is not the intellectualism of the Mannerists, but the forces that are relayed by it. Once applied to the history of art, we can effectively reverse Zuccarot's speculative etymology of design from the theoretical metamorphosis of the physical world into a material metamorphosis of the idea, another reversal of Platonism, since while the true has an essential form or norm, the false frees form from its subordination to the concept of truth. The real problem of Mannerism, the intuition that led it into conceptual speculation, is not that it is devoid of genius or the artistic idea, but rather that the idea does not exist outside and has to be found within its sensible expressions and its changing material conditions. The whole is not the same at the end as the beginning. It is in terms of this strict parallelism of theory and practice, eye and hand, that a reinterpretation becomes necessary of the concept of Mannerist disegno as a purely operational mode of knowing, a psychic relaying of, and sympathy with, a material existential catalysis. I felt like a lot of this touched on, quote, all color of atheism. And when Melville writes atheism, he doesn't mean not believing in God. What Melville is really saying is like an all encompassing skepticism. And there's moments where Melville, in various repetitions, that frustrate the systematic empiricism of the novel. You can imagine Melville taking an ironic distance to just enjoy watching an all-enveloping skepticism frustrate science. And I felt like that really pertained to this section a lot.
What was it about this section you liked?
All the talk about speculation and the ideas of art becomes philosophical, yet philosophy forgets art. Ishmael gets their philosophy through a surveying of art history at one point. So there is this melding of art history and philosophy in Moby Dick. Even outside all of the aesthetic elements, outside the tattoos, outside the various paintings, outside the various carvings and figures of the whale, there is like a literal surveying of art history where philosophy emerges from. that idea, speculation answers to an isolated and passionate cry that makes it both impossible and necessary to continue a rage of dispositions that leads to a contingency of form. A while ago, I got enraptured by the idea that there is a nothing that underpins all, that the only thing that lies outside of all relation is nothing, but that if nothing lies outside all relation, then that nothing has to be a something. And it just went down a circular rabbit hole. And earlier today, I went down a very similar circular rabbit hole of all is a copy of all is a copy of all. So nothing is original, which means that the original is nothing. And that just spiraled out. And a lot of this stems from a skepticism that just takes a hold of you and you have to reconcile with, even if it just becomes pure madness.
Yeah, just because something's safer to ignore doesn't mean you should.
Yeah, part of me was like, I should really get on organizing the rest of my notes, but the other part of me knew better and was like, no, you have to hash out this idea first of all being a copy of all and how to say it in a way that is different from what you said before, because I don't want to be reiterating something slightly differently. I want it to be enjoyable for my reader. All this really goes back to Emily in Montreal when talking about Nietzsche's will to power and difference and becoming as basically the same thing. They were saying
Yeah.
will to power is difference, but difference is just becoming. And so you have difference that is becoming and becoming that is difference. And so when you say something like difference, becoming difference, becoming difference, that could also be becoming difference, becoming difference, becoming difference, which could also be difference, 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 or becoming. And basically the eternal recurrence of will to power and the limit of thought, because you can't really go past it. But I've been trying to think of different ways to go about that.
I just wanted to give one thing here that creativity is not achieved at a single stroke, but involves a whole series of translations and transpositions from sketch to pentimento. And that means where an artist has painted a stroke and then they decide to paint it out or change it. So from sketch to pentimento to painting, from bozzetto to sculpture or building. And a bozzetto is a small scale model of a sculpture, like a maquette of a building, a very small one. So like creativity is not achieved at a single stroke, but involves a whole series of translations and transpositions from sketch to changes in the painting to painting, or from small scale models to sculpture or building. This means that, as Dewey puts it, wherever continuity is possible, a burden of proof rests upon those who assert opposition and dualism. Question, as Federico Zuccaro put in a well-known passage from Idea of the Sculptors, Painters and Architects, for the thought of the artist has to be not only clear but also free, and his spirit has to be released from and not limited by a mechanical dependence on such rules of execution provided by the mathematical sciences. And then at the end of that, it's about the reversal of it. Whether in art or philosophy, reason is a seeking, groping experimentation with its material ground. Ideas are pragmatic, just as their eventual speculative conceptualization always has a practical orientation. Despite some art historians' predilections for written sources over images, we should not limit ourselves to theoretical subjectivity independent of the objective execution of the work or art. What matters is not the intellectualism of the Mannerists, but the forces that are relayed by it. Once applied to the history of art, we can effectively reverse Zuccaro's speculative etymology of design from the theological metamorphosis of the physical world into a material metamorphosis of the idea, another reversal of Platonism, since while the true has an essential form or norm, eidos, the false, eidolon, frees form from its subordination to the concept of truth.
That section really reminded me of something Robert M. Greenberg wrote in Cetology, Center of Multiplicity and Discord in Moby Dick. Page 6, they wrote, "Yet it is important to note that Ishmael expresses a wish and that he cannot leap with poetry into an eternal sphere. This passage perhaps can be most valuably viewed as a delineation of the limits of poetic vision in Moby Dick in contrast, say, with Paradise Lost, its predecessor in the epic, where the fabled heavens are actualized, monarch and all. In Moby Dick, symbolism will yet assume a major role as a way to knowledge, but it will be a symbolism rising solidly and consistently out of a bedrock of physical fact in the chapters that study the whale's anatomy. It will not be the complete transcendental departure longed for here."
Yeah, so part of it is like a reversal there where he actually spent a lot of time out on the boats looking at whales, and he spent time hunting them and being on whale boats. This real solid material base, an actual empirical base from which he speaks of whales.
And it's interesting because at that time, the academics, their understanding of whales basically came from already deceased beached whales and the bones of whales. So whenever you got a drawing of a whale from an academic in the mid-19th century, it was the most ridiculous looking whale you've ever seen in your life.
Yeah.
And why the judges listened to the whalers over the academics during that legal battle when they were trying to figure out how to define the whale, when they started to realize that they were mammals.
He was at the cutting edge of whale technology.